thing that I want to talk about is my opinion of action research, what I think about it, and then I'll provide some definitions of what it is according to experts in the field. So first of all, action research is a bit like combing a beach for shells. Perhaps a bit cheesy, but I think that you can find similarities there. So if you imagine walking along the beach, aware of what's around you, you pause from time to time to think of the things that interest you and to examine them a bit further. So in my opinion, in the classroom, these shells can be literally anything that interests you, anything that you have more questions about, such as problems with student motivation, questions about teacher feedback, transformational themes within a course text, anything that you are more curious about. More specifically, action research involves taking a self-reflective, critical, and systematic approach to exploring your own teaching contexts. What I like about this definition is its emphasis on self-reflection. So in my mind, when I see that, I think that action research is less of a burden on an already heavy teaching schedule, and it's more about just pausing for a bit to really examine what you're already doing in your classroom. It's often viewed as a cycle with 5 different stages. The first is inquiry, so this is asking your question about whatever you're interested in your teaching. Second is the plan. Third is data collection, data analysis, and publication. Publication itself doesn't have to be publishing an actual article in a scholarly journal. It can just be engaging in dialogue with your colleagues, like what I'm doing now. And lastly, teachers conduct action research in order to improve teaching and learning. So the specific action research that I did occurred here at MUIDS, obviously. In my AP Lit classroom, I had 12 12th grade students. 3 of them were males and 9 were females. The action research that I did occurred in tandem with the AP curriculum, so that was really beneficial for everyone because I didn't need to create extra assignments or extra lessons to fit this. I used the curriculum that was already in place. And lastly, research cycles were developed based on my first semester knowledge of the students' interests, strengths, and areas for improvement. The research question that I used was what happens when I try to apply a critical approach to my 12th grade AP Lit class. And I'll define what critical means in the next slide. So the reason why I chose this research question is twofold. The first is one of my core beliefs as an educator, which is that it's important to create a safe classroom environment where students feel comfortable participating in honest and critical dialogue. So I point that out because I had already had this class throughout the first semester where I was already making this attempt to create a safe classroom environment based around dialogue. So this was like a natural next step. The second reason is Mahindong's vision, which is true success is not in the learning, but in its application to the benefit of mankind. I think that that's a very broad statement that pretty much no one knows how to actually implement in their classroom. So this was like my trying to take a stab at implementing that. So going back to what critical means, it comes from the concept of critical pedagogy, which is associated with Paulo Freire. He is a 20th century Brazilian educator and philosopher. And for him, literacy is a political act, in that schools serve as a place where students learn to become informed citizens. So students aren't looked at just as children or teenagers or young adults, they're looked at as members of a society. And the schools teach them how to listen, how to identify alternatives, how to consider possibilities, and how to search for multiple possible answers. I really liked this because I thought that it fit well with what we try to do at MUIDS, especially in the English department, and I think that a literature classroom especially lends itself well to this. More specifically, it's associated with issues of class, race, or gender, in which relations of power and inequality are often at their most obvious. So in my research, I focus more on race and gender. And it must involve reflective dialogue and transformative action. I think the easiest part of this to implement is the first one, reflective dialogue. and transformative action is a little bit more difficult, but I will come to that at the end. So the methods that I used for my research are here. There were 2 pieces of data, my perceptions and then the students' written and oral contributions to class, 4 different collection strategies, my lesson plans, recordings of lit circles, students' reflections, and students' essays. There were 2 sources, myself and the students, and the timetable for the research was from January through April, so the majority of second semester. I had a 1-week pre-cycle at the end of January, and then each of the actual cycles took place over 1 month. So cycle 1 in February, 2 in March, and 3 in April. So the reason for the pre-cycle was to ask students to reflect on what we were already doing in the class and to find out what kind of critical statements they would make on their own before I taught them anything about it and before I gave them those parameters. And so our unit at the time was a unit on satire, and I simply asked them to write a 1-paragraph reflection on satire and looked at how many of them made critical statements. Then the next 3 cycles aligned with our next 3 units. So we did what we had planned on doing, and I took chunks of their assignments to look at as data. Cycle 1 came from our unit on Heart of Darkness, and there were 3 assignments here. One was a reflection on the first chapter, another was a lit circle comparing a short story with similar themes to Heart of Darkness, and the third was a written argument about whether or not racism exists within Heart of Darkness as a novel. Then the second cycle aligned with our unit on metaphysical and modern poetry, and again there were 3 assignments. The first was a reflection on gender roles, the second was a creative response to gender roles, and the third was a written analysis on themes of racism and war in modern poetry. Then the third cycle aligned with our unit on modern novels, so we started with an analysis guide, moved to universal statements, and ended with an essay about issues of social concern. And in this unit, students received a lot more freedom to choose any 2 modern novels that they wanted to, and to look at any issues of social concern within them that they were interested in. So when I looked at the findings from these cycles, I came up with 4 different labels for the data. The first was no connections, so student does not make any connections to social trends or events. This only occurred in the pre-cycle. Level 1, 2, and 3, so each one building in specificity. The first one was student makes broad connections. The second, student makes broad connections and explains. And the third is student makes specific connections and explains in detail. So each level built in analysis. For pre-cycle results, you can see that 29% of the class did not make any connections at all. 43% of the class made level 1 connections, so over half of the class was doing something. And then 14% made level 2 and 14% made level 3. So to kind of give you an understanding of what I mean when I differentiated between 1, 2, and 3, I have different quotes from students' work. So the first one, level 1, satire is used to mock people, especially well-known persons in society. I thought this was a really clear, succinct statement, but it didn't explain anything and it didn't go on in detail. The next 2 examples, as you can see, have problems with grammar and syntax, but they explain and they go on in detail. Level 2 is, I think, satirical works have the power of persuasive by using authors' wit can create an enjoying text. So there's an attempt at reasoning. And then in level 3, the messages from the satire text and the comic provoke consciousness of people in effective ways. This stimulates me to connect with my society in Thailand, and I found out that what Swift said is really true. We live in the world where we blind ourselves by our pride. Then, just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on and show you the very last of the cycle 3 results. So this was the very last assignment that the class did during this research project. This was their essay about issues of social concern in novels. 25% of the class made level 1 statements, And then at level 2 and 3 increased substantially, so both went up to 37%. And then you can see, looking on the side, just how much more specific and detailed and analytical the statements became. Level 1, those who have power, whether from birth or self-advancement, are afraid to lose it. Level 2, great expectations in 1984 both demonstrate the concern of unfairness in society, while Dickens focuses on the gap between social classes. Orwell reveals oppression of the totalitarian government on their own citizen. So a much more clear and specific statement than in the pre-cycle, but still doesn't really go into as much detail as the level 3 statement. Vonnegut represents the issue of dehumanization through the theme of dystopia, where machines have control over humans, and then she gives a quote from the text. So overall, this is an overview of the results from all 3 cycles. I looked at all of the assignments that took place in each cycle, and then looked at the percentages of level 1, 2, and 3 statements throughout each. What you should be able to see is that the percentage of level 1 statements stayed about the same. The percentage of level 2 statements decreased over time as the level 3 statements increased. So my conclusion about that was firstly positive, because all students very quickly started making these critical statements on their own. And then also, over time, students started making stronger and more analytical statements as well. So, to conclude, a few limitations of the study are: 1, explicit student perceptions were not used as a source. So what I had intended was to conference with each individual student at the end of the research to find out their own perceptions, and that did not happen due to time constraints. The second limitation was a lack of triangulation, meaning that the only sources of data were myself and the students. I didn't have someone else also providing their perceptions. And thirdly, there were varied requirements for students' written and oral contributions to class. So obviously, when you have reflections, oral recordings, and then essays, you have different word count and page length, which provides different opportunities for students to make these kinds of statements. Lastly, 2 conclusions. The first is that teaching students to critically approach literature deepens their understanding of the text and strengthens their analysis. And secondly, more research needs to be done about how to bridge the gap between dialogue and action. So this second part is what I pointed out earlier with the definition of critical pedagogy. And I think that with more research, it would help teachers be able to figure out how do we teach students not just to talk about issues of class, race, and gender, how do we teach them to go out into society and actually act on it as well. All right, I think we have about 5 minutes for questions, so if you have any, you can ask them now.
Did it seem like the same students were making the level 1 statements through all 3 cycles, or was it different students each cycle making level 1 statements?
Okay, so just to repeat for the recording, were the same students making level 1 statements throughout, or did it change?
Yes.
Okay. From what I can recall, it shifted over time. So different students were making level 1 statements at different points. My personal opinion about that is it had to do with students' own interest and how much time they had devoted to the assignment. Yes.
I know this is for AP literature, but could you expect the same results with lower ability students?
Okay, so if you applied this to another class, could you expect the same results, right? I think that you could, but with lower level students, you would have to take a little bit more time to guide them through the process of what you mean by making a critical statement. I think you just have to show more examples and give them more time to practice, but I don't see any reason why they could do it themselves. I think it's something that they're thinking about and talking about with their friends anyway. It's just a matter of doing it in an academic setting in another language. Any other questions?
Did you have students come to the realization themselves that they were seeing this literature or reading it in a deeper way and talking about it in a more meaningful way?
Yeah, so what you're asking is, did I Yeah, that's a good question. I forgot to mention this earlier. The only thing that I was pushing for within the context of the class was that students start making any connection to societal trends and events. I wasn't pushing them to grow from level 1 to level 3. So I think that was a really interesting outcome, that just naturally, the more that we talked about it in class, the more that they started to strengthen their own statements. I didn't ask them to do that.
Were the students aware that you were doing this study? And if so, do you think it actually influenced their work?
Okay, so were they aware that they were part of the study?
Yeah. And do you think it would have, if so, do you think it made a difference to what they were doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't tell them specifically that this was part of a study because I'm not using any of the raw data and I'm not using any of the audio recordings to play for people, so they can't be identified in that way. I did ask them at the end of the semester if they were okay with their work being shown in the future to adults and students as examples, and they all said yes. But I guess I wouldn't know how to answer if it made a difference or not, because I didn't talk to them explicitly about it first.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? Yes.
Did you notice them bringing other classes into the discussion and making connections to what classes they're taking?
Okay, so did they make connections to other classes? Yeah, I did, especially when we did our unit on Heart of Darkness. A lot of the students were taking globalization classes. I think it's an elective, and so a lot of them were teaching